Welcome to the podcast, The Next Big Thing. I'm your host, Keith D. Terry, a consultant, a coach, and a serial entrepreneur. The mission here is to teach, inspire, and to motivate. I am truly excited about our guest today. Mr. Steve Hagerty is the founder and CEO of Hagerty Consulting and the 21st mayor of Evanston. Welcome to the show. How are you, my friend?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Keith. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
All right. Well, Steve, I just want to start by, saying I've known you for many years and you are a delightful person. And I love that. And I'm just looking forward to this conversation. So I know you, but my listeners don't. So who is Steve Hagerty?
Steve Hagerty, is just like anybody else, really. I'm no different than anyone else. For me, I grew up on a small farm in Massachusetts. My parents were school teachers. They had read these James Herriot books, all things, great and beautiful. And he had a whole line of books. And they, became consumed with the idea that they should build a farm, build a
Okay.
barn, and fill it with animals. And they did that back in like 1975, 1976 period. My dad and a friend built it over the summer, and a farm creates a lot of opportunities for kids. And in their case, there are three in my family. I'm the oldest. I have two younger brothers. We're all 2.5 years apart. And at a really young age, we just started working the farm. Literally,
Okay.
collecting the eggs, milking the cow, planting the garden, harvesting the garden. We all had a section of the garden that we were responsible for. All the scrap lumber that my dad didn't use for the barn turned into this magnificent 3.5 story fort that we've
Oh,
built. Some people that have been to my LinkedIn page or my Facebook page have seen this fort, and it literally elicits so many comments. Like, you look at this fort, you're like, how in the world is Steve Hagerty still alive? How did he and his brothers not crash? And my father did inspect the fort. It would never have passed any kind of city permit process.
right.
So luckily we didn't do that. But it was a great way to grow up, because on a farm, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but there's also a lot of opportunities to become entrepreneurial at a really young age. And my brothers and I were that way. Literally, we'd harvest the vegetables, and we'd have so many zucchini and summer squash and tomatoes and everything. Literally, my dad would be like, well, get the wheelbarrow and start going down the street and knocking on doors and seeing if any of these neighbors want to buy
Oh,
it.
wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
That's
I mean, we
good.
were organic before organic was a big thing, and
Gotcha.
who knew I could have put a premium on
Well,
on
it's
like,
interesting. Does your family still have the farm?
my parents divorced when I was separated and divorced when I was in my 20s.
Okay.
My dad still lives next door to where I grew up,
Okay.
and has a little farm. He has a horse, he has a goat, he has
All
some
right.
chickens. A couple of them get to run free around the yard. He had about 10 acres. He gave 8 of those acres to the Audubon Society a few years back. But yeah, I was just there last week, and it's great.
Well,
It's great.
Steve, I was going to say, my family hails from the South, and my mom, my mother's side, still has the family farm. It's about, maybe it's a huge one in Mississippi, and I think back to when my mom, there are 11 of them, get around the table and they're talking about what they did, the entrepreneurial spirit. If you want something to eat, go out in the field and get you some blackberries
That's
or a
right.
watermelon and eat it and do what you need to do. So that's great. So, you left there, and did you ever become a big city guy, or you went from there to school?
No, I mean, I would do like the class trip, like a lot of us did in high school, to say New York City. And oh, I didn't like it. It was way too big. There were too many people, all
Right.
all of that. It was only later in life that I came to love urban areas in this country, and have
Okay.
spent a lot of time in urban areas. But no, growing up, I mean, Attleboro, where I grew up, was a manufacturing town. It used to be the jewelry capital of the world. Balfour's and Jostens Jewelers was there. Everyone worked, had some connection to that industry. And then with globalization, it left, and it's pretty much sort of a commuter town now, affordable commuter town to Boston or to Providence. But it was a
So
great
what?
place to grow up.
So as we meander this conversation,
Yeah.
reading your bio, and using your background, did you see? Is there a connection between where you are now, both as a public servant and as a CEO? Is there a journey that you can
Sure,
share?
of course. I mean, I think everybody has a life journey. The problem is none of us know exactly. We're on the journey, each of us individually. We don't know where that journey is going to end or where that journey is going to take us. But in hindsight, we can look at our journey and say, yeah, it made sense. And so, to your question here, yeah, I mean, all even though I didn't think of myself as an entrepreneur until I was really in my 20s, later in my 20s, mid
Okay.
20s. Uh, all those things that I was doing as a kid absolutely played a part in being willing to go out on my own and start something. I mean, we were big time into 4-H, and so 4-H is a youth development organization focused on kids that tend to grow up on farms, and lots of people in Mississippi or Kansas, where Lisa, my wife, is from, are members of either 4-H or Future Farmers of America. Those are sort of the
Okay.
two youth development organizations. And so we were really big into 4-H. And so 4-H provided all sorts of leadership opportunities for me and my brothers and other members. My parents were both the leaders of the club. That was the Red Wing 4-H club. It was focused on poultry and gardening. And I ultimately sort of rose up through 4-H at the county level, at the state level, at the national level to win sort of a national leadership award when I was quite young. And so, a big part of being an entrepreneur and starting a company that ultimately, has 450 employees
Right.
and hundreds of other independent consultants that work with us. A big part of that is creating a sense of purpose and inspiring people to join you on this mission
Okay.
that you're on. And I think a lot of that started just with the kind of childhood that I had and all the different 4-H clubs that I was involved in and was sort of a leader of at a young age, or the sports clubs at Attleboro High School that I was a member of and ultimately became the
You
captain
know
of.
what I find interesting when you start when I as I do my podcast, and I've done 40 of these sessions now. It's interesting how people, where they end up from a career perspective. Is there a connection? What led you into emergency management? In the context of knowing yourself. I mean,
Mm.
I get it from the context of being a smart businessman seeing an opportunity, but did you know you would be as successful or happy, looking at the happiness meter as you are?
Keith, I had no idea what emergency management was. So let's be honest here. I never thought when I was young or even like in my 20s, like, oh, I'm going to have a career in emergency management. What I knew is that, I had an interest in public service and government. I mean, both my parents,
Okay.
again, were school teachers. My mom just for a couple years, and then she raised my two brothers and I, my dad for his entire career. Um, I was a good student and athlete and all that stuff growing up. But I wasn't good enough to like play in college or anything like
Okay.
that. So then when it came time to apply to college, um, like lots of young people, I said, okay, have I done everything that I can in terms of being involved in things and have studied hard and all that? And I probably had a
Okay.
B plus average in high school. Um, the thing that I did really poorly at, and I still do to this day, if you gave me a standardized test to take, Keith, I will guarantee you I will finish probably in the bottom 10 or 15 percentile. And true to form, I did back then when I was in high school, and that created some real challenges for me because we have relatives in Ithaca, and I really wanted to go to Cornell University. I'd been up there a few times,
Okay. Okay.
beautiful, but I had terrible SAT scores. I took Stanley Kaplan, which was the prep class, 4 times. They guaranteed that they're going to get your
Right.
score
Right.
up so many points, and if you don't get it up, then you can take it again. I had to take it 4 times, and my score went up like 30 points, and it literally. I don't even want to share it with your listeners here because
Right.
it's so
I
it's so
won't ask you.
embarrassing.
I
Other
won't
than
ask
I
you.
set the bar so low that my children will be able to exceed this. Okay, like
I hear
that
you.
that should be the bar's been set pretty low. Um, but I applied to a lot of colleges, and this is at a time, right, when you and I applied, where there weren't these standardized forms, the
Yes.
uniform
Right.
thing, and
Right.
so I ended up applying to 16 colleges, and
Wow,
my
that is a
and
lot.
this is that's a lot at a time when you have to like do separate applications for all of
Yeah.
them and everything. I had gone on a tour of the country to visit these colleges, and literally my parents were working. They couldn't come with me. I drove the family station wagon around the East Coast by myself and stopped at all these universities. And the last one that I go to is Syracuse University. And I go and I meet with one of the admissions counselors, and she spends about an hour with me. And at the end, and we
Oh,
have a nice conversation. And at the end, she says, Steve, it might be best that you not apply to Syracuse. Like your SAT scores are just too low, that low.
okay.
And so I apply to the 16 colleges, and my mom says, Steve, would you do an application for Syracuse? I was like, Mom, didn't you hear what I told you? Like the lady told me, don't even bother applying. You're that dumb. And she's like, just do it for me. And you know how moms can be,
Yep,
right?
yep, yep,
Which
yep.
is a
You want to
wonderful
please them,
quality of moms, okay,
right?
and stuff. And so I'm like, fine, I'll do it just for you, Mom. But I wasn't happy about it. And so I submit the application. Well, I get the feedback, 3 months later from all these universities. Of the 17 total colleges I've applied, I've gotten rejected from 9, including my own state college, which was UMass, which people
Right.
still give me a hard time about that. I couldn't even get into my own state university. And again, I had good grades, I had leadership, extracurricular activities, I had all of that. And I get this letter from Cornell. In the Cornell letter is a rejection letter, but it's the nicest rejection letter you'll ever get.
Okay.
It was like,
Okay.
Dear Steve, thank you so much for applying to Cornell. We wish we had a position here for you, but we don't. But we want you to go to another university. We want you to take these classes. And they specifically laid out the classes they wanted me to take. And then we
Okay.
want you to reapply to Cornell. And so I then, of those 8 acceptances, I get into Syracuse University. Despite what that admissions counselor said, they accepted
Yeah.
me. And we do have a family, and I may have been the beneficiary of legacies, right? Because
And
my
whatever works.
my
Right.
uncle went there, my
Right.
cousin went there, was very close to that part of the family. I ended up going there. My younger brother, my middle brother, Jim, ended up going to Syracuse. So I go to Syracuse. Um, and I miss home for the first year, like a lot of kids, especially that first
Yeah.
semester,
Yeah.
And I thought I was doing well, and then I got my grades, and I got like a 2.7 GPA, and then the second semester I sort of turned it around. I got a 3.4 GPA. It's all
Okay.
together. It was like a 3.0. I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to apply to Cornell again. So, because Cornell
You
told
know
me to
what
take
I'm
the
gonna.
classes,
You know
I
what
took
I'm.
the classes. I applied to Cornell, and I got rejected again. So I'm a twice rejectee from Cornell. That'll come back later in our discussion.
So now you know what I'm gonna ask. So from there, you go to Price Waterhouse Coopers, and then you start Hagerty Consulting. So very quickly, is there since we're talking about knowing yourself, um, clearly I can see that you knew yourself in college. You knew you need to hustle. You needed to do all those things. What's the connection? What gave you the inspiration to first go into consulting? And
Yeah,
then the second one is how start Hagerty Consulting.
yeah. It's the same thing with emergency management, Keith. I knew nothing about consulting. I couldn't tell you what management consulting was. All right. I mean, the reality is, I have 4 great years at Syracuse. I have to, of course, listen to these Cornell students when we be playing basketball with them at the Carrier Dome. Syracuse be beating them by like 30 points, and they would start to chant, "That's all right. That's okay. You'll be working for us someday." And it was like a
Wow.
dagger in my heart,
Wow. Wow.
And
Wow.
so, I thought I wanted to go to law school. I did as poorly on the LSAT as I did on the SAT. I um, I was in tears when I got the feedback about what
Mhm.
my scores were. I went to an advisor of mine, Dr. Margaret Charters, who's deceased, but was a wonderful, wonderful advisor. And she was like, well, why do you want to go to law school, Steve? And I'm like, well, I don't really want to be a lawyer, but I want to have the skills of a lawyer. And she said, well, we've got one of the best public administration programs in government schools in the entire country right here, the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. And why don't I set up a meeting with you over there? And so I went over there, and they were kind enough. to accept my LSAT score, not make me take the GRE. And I put my application in. And I ended up going straight from undergrad to grad school. So I spent 6 years at
Okay.
Syracuse.
Okay.
And now it's time to graduate. Now it's time to get a job. And all I know is that I want to work for the government, Keith. And
Okay.
so I apply for 50 to 75 government jobs.
Now, why the government?
You know what? Again, I think it was, I've always had an interest in serving other people.
Okay.
Again, I think part of it's the fact that my parents were school teachers and all of that. And so, that's why I wanted to study government and everything. And so it sort of it made sense to me. And I thought, like, I should get one of these jobs. I mean, I
Okay.
was qualified, in my opinion, at least for a handful of these jobs, but I
Right.
was rejected from all of them. Again, rejected from Cornell, rejected from all of these jobs. And so, here I am. We finished school in, let's say, May of 93.
Okay.
I don't have a job. I see this thing in August of 93 in the SU Career Center newsletter. It wasn't even coming out of the Maxwell School. And it
Okay.
basically says, hey, we're looking to hire a management consultant at Price Waterhouse in the Office of Government Services. I have no idea what management consulting is. I have no idea what Price Waterhouse is, but it has the word government in it, and I want to work for government. So I'm going to apply for this job.
Okay.
I apply for this job. I should also say, after getting rejected 75 times from all these government jobs, I retooled my resume because I thought this must be the problem. It's my resume. And so I created a 4-page resume.
Wow. Early in your
I said,
career.
clearly I'm not communicating enough to these folks why they should hire me. But it was really a 1-page resume, but it was on paper where you could fold the paper in half where it would become 8.5 by 11. So on the
Okay.
front, it had my name. It said Stephen Hagerty. And by each letter of my name, I had an adjective to
Did you?
help them understand who Steve Hagerty was.
So
And
you differentiated yourself. Okay.
exactly. So my favorite one was why. And my why adjective was youthful. Because isn't that what you need as an employer? Don't you think like, man, I need a youthful employee here? And so, you open it up and it's got all my quote my experience, and then on the back page it's got my thing. So I send out my retooled resume. Price Waterhouse calls and says, "Hey, we want to fly you down here and interview." So I fly down and I interview with them. And the last guy that I interviewed was the most senior guy at Price Waterhouse, and he was a director named Dave Ziske. And Dave leans back and opens up my 4-page resume. And he goes, Steve, I see that you graduated in May. It's August now. Like, what have you been doing? I said, well, Dave, I've been taking tennis lessons. And I said, oh, and my brother and I, we have this loft building business. He goes, loft building business, what's this? I said, well, the dorms are really small. And so a lot of those students would like to raise their bed. My brother, Jim, is super handy and can build things. I can't, but he can build things. And so we basically created this loft building business. We had flyers all over the campus. The flyer said, get it up, build a loft. And then my contribution to the flyer was, don't be loft out, call
Don't
now.
be lost out.
I knew one of the owners who owned a retail store down on the main strip of Syracuse, which is called Marshall Street. And she's like, Steve, we need a model loft out here. I'm like, okay. So we put a model loft out there. Lisa, my now wife, who literally sat there at the model loft, and people would walk by with their son or their daughter. They'd be like, oh my God, Mary or Johnny, you need one of these. They would
Okay.
write us a check for
Wait, wait.
$110. We would schedule them in for when we were going to do that. We cut a deal with the lumber company. We had all this wood dropped at our apartment that
Okay.
we're renting. My brother had a Geo Metro. We could fit 2 of these pre-cut lofts into
So
there.
I see the entrepreneurial connection here. From early selling of fruits and vegetables to a loft business, which is pretty ingenious. Back in college. You know, um,
It was a
so
nice way it was a good way to make a buck, Keith. I mean, we made several. And the funny thing is, so I tell this story to Dave Ziske. All right. The next day, not even 24 hours after this interview, I get a call from Price Waterhouse says, we want to offer you a job. Finally, somebody, after all these rejections, somebody wants to offer me a job. And I always tell young people when I'm speaking on campuses or anything, if someone offers you a job within 24 hours, unless it's my company, you should ask for more money. Because clearly they want you, right? I mean, man, we definitely need you. I was so excited that somebody wanted to offer me a job. I accepted on the spot. Um, and then the story ends this way. And again, I love the ending of this story, and I think
Okay.
it's important for your listeners and everyone just to think about. So the story ends that I start at Pricewaterhouse on September 20th, 1993. That evening, there's a reception. So all the partners are there, all the staff are there, and
Okay.
everything. Dave Ziske says to one of the senior partners, he says, "Oh, Kevin, come on over here. I want to introduce you to Steve Hagerty." And Kevin Bacon is his name. He likes to say he was born 7 years before the Kevin Bacon we all know. Kevin
Yeah.
Bacon
Right.
comes over and says, and looks right at me and says, "Steve Hagerty?" He says, "You're the loft man I heard about. It wasn't your good grades that got you this job or your extracurricular activities or your leadership. It was your entrepreneurial spirit." And you know,
Gotcha.
and you know something, Keith? Nowhere on that 4-page resume was my loft business. I never looked or thought of myself as entrepreneurial, even
Gotcha.
though clearly was, growing
Yeah.
up a farm and
Yeah.
all of that. Yet I never ever put that onto my resume. It only came up because Dave Siskey said, "Well, it's August now. What have you been doing, Steve?" And so I always tell people, like, it's really important to take some time and think about the essence of you. Who are you
Gotcha.
really? And
Okay.
make sure that that's conveyed in your cover letter and in your resume and in your communication when you're interviewing for different opportunities.
Now, are you seeing that? Because I wanna get a little bit further into the emergency management because you're again you're in a business that's serving. Um, you've been mayor that's serving. Are you seeing that people are not really able to get to the essence of who they are? Are you finding that it's harder to find people who truly know themselves, or is it easier? Or
You know what? I actually think with the younger generation in particular, there's a real attunement, to
yeah,
who they are and what they want to do. But I do think, like, you choose a job, you choose a career. And so there can be something that you're really passionate about. There can be plenty of people that are really interested in helping people on their worst day. I mean, I get the privilege, and all the people that work for my company, of helping people when something really bad has happened. And we're
yes,
very fortunate because the United States government and our elected officials over the years have said, we're going to help our neighbors when there's a tornado or an earthquake or a terrorist attack or all of that. And there's lots of people that want to be a part of that. The challenge is the 8 years that I spent at Price Waterhouse, the first 4 years of when I started Hagerty Consulting, I was on the road 90% of the time. And I wasn't coming home every weekend. I mean, when you went on the
oh wow,
road to work a recovery after the Northridge earthquake or 9/11 or Hurricane Katrina, you went out there and you were working 70, 75, 80 hours a week.
you were in it.
And you were in it and you were working weekends. And so you would only get to come back once a month for what we called a rotation. And you'd rotate home for 4 or 5 days. They give you a little extra than a weekend. And then you went right back out into the
Now, was
field.
that your life at Price Waterhouse, or was it
That
the
was my
early
life for the
days of
first. That
Hagerty?
was my life for the first 12 years of my career, Keith. I was a
Okay,
nomad. I lived all
wow,
over the United States. I had no sense of community at home. My my career from when I was a young person certainly wasn't unfolding the way I thought it would. In that, probably when I was younger, I thought, well, I'm going to be embedded in a community and really, know a
okay.
community. But I grew up in Attleboro, lived in Attleboro till I went to college. So that was 18 years. After that, lived in Washington for 4 years, Baltimore for 4 years, Evanston for 4 years. And then ultimately, Lisa and I made the decision to settle down here. But for that 12-year period of, Washington and Baltimore, in Evanston for the first 4 years, yeah, I was on the road
I
constantly.
would assume.
I didn't know anybody. We moved to Evanston. We didn't know a single person. Lisa and I knew nobody. We have no relatives here.
Are you serious?
Anything. No.
Wow,
And it's one of the things
wow,
I'm super proud of personally. Like, wow, we moved to a community where we knew nobody. And like 16 years later, I became the mayor of a great,
right.
one of the best urban ring cities in America. Like,
That is a phenomenal story.
that makes me feel pretty good.
Now, so let's peel back the onion a little bit. So I love this. So you know over time, I would assume helping. I mean, you've seen some of the worst calamities in the United States.
Yes.
Did that change you? How did that impact you? And Because I want to get further into the connection now to
Yeah,
why you ran for mayor.
sure.
But let's
So
stay on this
yeah,
Hagerty
yeah. So
part.
for in terms of the disasters, right? I mean, I was in New York soon after 9/11. You know, terrible, historic, right, event. I was in Northridge after the earthquake long ago. I've seen terrible floods, the fires, all of that stuff. The the thing that I just want to make sure your listeners are aware. So when Hagerty goes into an event, we're generally working with, the city manager, the mayor, the finance director. We're not out there necessarily working with the victims per se. Okay. And so we're a little removed from that. So all we do at Hagerty Consulting is we help communities prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. Period. We aren't an accounting firm, an engineering firm that has a unit that, quote, does disasters. We're not distracted like I think some of our main competitors are, who are doing debris monitoring, who are doing, housing inspections, putting needles in people's arms, putting blue tarps on roofs after hurricanes, all of which are important, but none of which is management consulting. So all we are doing is focus on management consulting. I think we have the broadest sort of and the deepest expertise in that area. I actually, I guess you could go into a disaster and either feel really, really sad and like, be pretty depressed about it. Okay.
Hmm.
And that's a natural and understandable feeling. Or you could also go in and say, wow, this is a time when when the people really need the help of the government. And
Gotcha.
I tend to take that approach. Like we are very, very mission focused during a disaster, because you don't have power, you don't have housing, you don't have food. All of this, materials and resources need to get into the community, and we need to stand this community back up. And what I have seen time and time again is those communities that have a strong social fabric before a disaster, are communities that respond better and recover faster
Gotcha.
from those events. And so I just find it, actually. I wish none of these events ever occurred.
Right.
And
And when you said so, let's stay there for a second because I want to make sure I understand. You said a strong social
fabric.
fabric,
Yeah.
and when you say social, you mean the city has programs to help people. What do you mean
Yeah.
exactly?
But what I mean by that is, um, it's the community. Like, what are all of the different networks that exist in that
Gotcha.
community? Okay, I sometimes say to people, and I said this when I was mayor, and people said, "Oh, you can't say this, Steve." And I said, "Give me a break." But what I said is, I said, "Listen, if your plan is after a disaster that the government's going to save you, or that your business is going to save you, or that your church is going to save you, then you don't have a plan. Like it's incumbent
Right.
upon all of us, okay, to have a plan." And so, communities that have strong social networks, to me, that means service organizations, faith-based organizations, business
Hmm.
organizations, nonprofit, government,
Hmm.
all of that. It can't just be, oh, yeah, we have a really strong social fabric from our government. The government
Right.
alone is not going to do this, okay? And so when we had COVID and you saw everything that happened in this country, and we were very, very involved in COVID, and I happened to have been the mayor at the time here in Evanston during that. Evanston did a phenomenal job, in my opinion, on that. And it was because it was a whole of community response and recovery effort. And
Yes,
that,
it was.
we very much preach that out of the gate, that we all have to work together. And so those communities that already have that before something bad has happened, not surprisingly, are going to do better responding to it and then recovering from it. But those communities that are sort of more divisive or torn apart, or don't have those kind of solid networks. And so I think there's an opportunity when we talk about resilience in this country. There's an opportunity for every single person to be involved in thinking, how can I help make my community stronger? It could be as simple as, I'm going to join the Rotary Club.
Got
You know what? Or I'm going to, I'm going to go to that church picnic, or I'm going to start to go to some of these city council meetings and actually see what happens, or I'm going to join a city board or commission. There are opportunities there for all of us. But we have to take that step forward and put ourselves out there and not be afraid that of rejection.
No,
And then
I
right,
have,
you've taken from this whole story, like, I got a lot of rejection. And the reality is, if you are pushing yourself, you have failed more on a absolute basis than you have succeeded. But on a real basis, you've succeeded more than you failed.
I see. And I would assume, given your your experience, you decided to run for mayor. What was the thinking behind that? Was it to serve?
My thinking was, I've spent 20 years helping people on their worst day. I want to help my community every day. And
Gotcha.
that was a line that I used during the
Gotcha.
campaign. And again, I've always had an
Makes sense.
interest in working for government. I
Makes
applied for all
sense.
those jobs. Government didn't want to hire me, so I said, "Well, I'll put myself out there to the people, and we'll see if the people
Well,
want to
I,
hire
I
me."
I lived there when COVID happened, and I know your background, and so I would have, COVID was so my background, my undergrad degree is bacteriology, and when they said it was a novel virus, it was the first time I was really, really terrified,
Yeah.
and I mean terrified because I know I've been around viruses and bacteria for a long time in my lifetime, and so, but given that you had emergency management experience, entrepreneurial experience, what was going through your mind the early days of that?
So
Because not often do I get to talk to someone that started a successful business and been a former mayor. So I want to
yeah,
know what was
yeah.
going through your mind.
So if we take everybody back, right, to early 2020, um, Uh, there's terrible stuff going on with COVID over in Italy. We're all seeing it on TV. Then we start to have a couple cases out west in Washington State and California, here in the United States. Now we're in the February, early March time frame. Um, what I'm thinking is, we need to have a whole community response. I don't want anybody out there thinking like, oh, the mayor's somehow single-handedly going to handle this, or our city government is going to handle this, or the fire department's got it, or whatever, or the health department. Like, we're all going to have to pitch in. And so I had two young kids actually in this community, and their mother, who I know, who had called me and said, my kids are really worried about what they're seeing on TV. Would you mind talking to them? And this was in late April. This was in late February. I invited them to the office. We met in the mayor's office. Their mom was there as well. I invited our health department director and the deputy director, and we
Okay.
talked to them, and we tried to alleviate, some of their concerns about what we would be doing to make sure that we are prepared if this comes here. And after that meeting, I sent a communication out to the entire city, and at the time, I think we had 45,000 people that followed the mayor in my newsletter. It went up to over 80,000 people in a
Wow.
year. So lots of people. That was our main method of communicating with people. And I basically had a photo of the two young boys, me, the health director, and everything. And I said they're worried, and I used that as sort of a launching pad for us as a community. But the next thing that happened is the president, this is President Trump at the time, declares a national state of emergency. Keith, I've been in this business my whole career. Never have we had a national state of emergency, right? A national state of
Wow.
emergency would be a pandemic. It would be a war if we were attacked, right?
Right.
As a country, they might declare that. And so that was big news. And that happened on Friday, March 13th. That was the same day that I was supposed to do the State of the City address, which I was excited about doing because it's the one time a year I get to sort of put everything together about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and where we're going.
Okay.
And am I going to have 300 people in a ballroom when this is going on, even though we don't have one case in Evanston yet? I cancel it, right? Because again, I'm trying to send a message. President comes out, we cancel the State of the City. And that weekend, and I was the first to declare, and I had the authority as the mayor of Evanston to do this, to declare a local state of emergency. We were the first city in Illinois to do that. I was a little nervous because I thought, well, some people are going to ride me and say, Hagerty's overreacting. We don't even have one case of COVID here.
Right.
But the
Right.
reality was, it's coming. And I'm trying to like send up a flare to everybody in Evanston and say, folks, this is coming our way. and we all need to do something. Okay. And we all have a part to play. And so that was why I declared the local state of emergency. I then followed up again with another bit of communication. Then the third thing that I did in that same week that I think was critical to our recovery, and it's something that I preach to our clients when I'm out there talking, is that it has to be a whole of community response and recovery from these events. If you're trying to do that, it means you need to put together and gather the community leaders in all the different sectors. And so
Yes.
for us, what were those sectors? I literally sat in the mayor's office and I'm like, okay, I got the business sector, the nonprofit sector, the faith community, the senior living community, because this is going to affect them, the healthcare community. And then I thought, okay, who do I think are the strongest leaders in each of those sectors that I'm going to call on and ask them to be part of the mayor's COVID-19 task force? And I have a request of them. When I call the president of the hospital and say, listen, I'm putting this task force together. We are going to meet twice a week initially. And then as time went on, it became once a week. There were ultimately about 50 or 60 people that were on this task force and these calls. I am going to ask each of you as the leader of your sector, and oftentimes I had two leaders, so I had sort of like
Right.
co-leads.
Right.
You guys are to go organize your entire sector. I don't have time to go organize. You're going to go organize the whole education sector here in Evanston. You're going to go organize the nonprofit sector. And you are going to have working groups that are feeding information up to you. And that's what I created that first week of the pandemic, right after I declared the local state of emergency. And the other thing that we did, and we were the first to do it, is we activated the Emergency Operations Center here in Evanston. And just an interesting fact, we have a joint emergency operations center with Northwestern University. It's actually at their
Oh, wow.
public safety facility up on Ridge Avenue. But because
Okay.
of the nature of this disaster, we had to abandon that facility because we were all too close to one another. And again, none of
I
us, it was
see.
novel, as you said, none
I
of us
see.
knew exactly, okay, what is this
Right.
virus? And what if one of us has this virus? And now we transfer it, and all of us who are like the leaders of the city from fire and police and parks and rec and all this, all of us get sick. Like, this is going to be bad. And so we moved it over to a brand new community center, state of the art. It's won national awards, the Robert Crown Community Center. We moved the operation over there. And that hadn't even been open to the public. So the first thing that Robert Crown Community Center was ever used for was as the emergency operations center for
I
COVID-19.
remember
And
that.
it was that facility, it was used in that capacity for the first 6 months of its existence.
And how much of your time during that, because this is the last question on that, uh, were you? I assume you were an example for other cities across the country. Were you in communication with other mayors, and they were modeling what
Yeah,
you're
the
what
U.S.
you were here?
Conference of Mayors did a great job of creating a forum for mayors to communicate and talk to each other. I was on lots of calls with Dr. Fauci, with other mayors and stuff like that.
Hmm.
I also got to say, I mean, Governor Pritzker, J.B. Pritzker, did an outstanding job, and Dr. Ezike, who was
Yeah.
his Secretary of Health and Human Services for the state of Illinois. I mean, just like I had created this task force here in Evanston, they were bringing together all these mayors, and then they were feeding information down. So I would have a once, or initially it was twice a week, call with the governor and Dr. Ezike and 400 other people that were on this call. But they did an outstanding job of that. We then did the same thing. I mean, there was a cadence to these calls and a lot of thought put into how that agenda was going to work. Um, in the beginning of that agenda, I was basically pushing information down to this group of leaders within the city. And then I would have a spotlight. I would take somebody, let's say Congresswoman Schakowsky, I would have her on periodically and say, hey, Jan, give us an update on what's going on in Washington and some of the aid packages that you're all discussing and maybe coming down to the local level. Then we would turn to all of the different working groups that we had, and I would have report outs from, okay, senior living community, report out, nonprofit, report out. It was incredibly effective. And in fact, a year later, when we'd had a vaccine and all of that, people didn't want this task force to end. They said, well, Mayor, we got to pivot this to something else. But as you know, I opted not to run for a second term. And so I was like, well, this will be up to the new mayor and the new council.
Well,
Um,
maybe I'm wrong, but I would assume that some of it continues in the work that Hagerty Consulting does, because you can now take that model and um, suggest that other
mhm.
cities follow a similar kind of plan.
Yeah.
And and I thank you for the time. I just have a couple of more questions before we run out of time, and that is, you know, um, I can see the trend, from an early, when you were on the farm helping people selling fruits and vegetables, to the you were the, what do you call it, the loft guy, to
Yep.
helping people,
Yep.
to Price Hot Waterhouse. What's next for Steve Haggerty and Haggerty Consulting, to continue
Boy.
to grow, to continue to
Now you're
serve?
asking. Now you're asking the tough questions. I mean, look, the reality is that climate change is real. We're all experiencing. We're living it, right? We're experiencing it all the time. I mean, the size of Haggerty Consulting. It's funny now. I think a lot of us get distorted in the world that we live in now because billions are thrown around all the time, or even trillions now. You've got five companies that have all exceeded $1 trillion worth of value. And so some of your listeners, to provide context, some of your listeners might say, "Oh, well, this company's not that big, 450 employees and all that." But the reality is, Keith, we are, as a company, just in this space, and we just have this niche, as I described earlier, in management consulting, but in emergency management, we are larger than most emergency management departments across the entire country,
I
right?
believe
I
that.
mean,
Oh, I
big
know
states,
I've done
right?
the
And
research.
so
Right.
they depend on us, and so we have lots of standing contracts with counties and cities and states and even the federal government to help. So we always have to be ready. We're going into hurricane season. There's going to be more intense storms. All of that. We're out there. We're meeting with our clients. We are working. We have a cadre of another 1,000+ people, right? Who, if something happens, we already have existing agreements with folks. And so we can move really quickly. If there's an earthquake in California tomorrow and, they need 50 people out there with certain specialties, we have the ability to move quickly to do that. So we're laser focused on just helping people on their worst day when something really
Gotcha.
bad
Now,
happens
Steve,
and doing that
do
kind of
you
work.
see a threat or an emergency around AI?
I mean, I think there's going to be amazing positive things that come out of AI. Are there going to be negative things? Yeah, of course. Look, what I can tell you now in terms of the threat in emergency management, it's really around more misinformation and disinformation. But AI is being used for that, right? There was just something that came out recently in the New York Times that says it's advanced so far that now people really can't tell the difference between images, right, that are AI generated and
Mhm.
real images. And now all of a sudden you're going to fake people out and think, okay, did this really happen? Because I'm looking at it with my own two eyes, and yet it could be manufactured. We are seeing mis and disinformation by our adversaries. And we saw that with the train derailment in Palestine, Ohio, right?
Yes.
Where they think it was Russians, got involved and they started putting all this stuff out on social media that was untrue about the chemicals and the government, da da da. And then we saw the same thing with the fire out in Maui, where it's been attributed to the Chinese, where a bunch of misinformation came out about that this is a new weapon that the United States was experimenting on, where we can create these fires and burn down communities, right? And again, to the extent that people believe some of this stuff, um, we have real challenges as a country and as communities. And again, I would think that where do people trust the most? They trust at the local level. They trust people that they know. And
Yes,
so
without a doubt.
when I talked about the social fabric earlier, it also applies to the relationships that we have and having those kind of relationships, right? So somebody, if a disaster happened here in Evanston, they might be spewing things, adversaries might, online for some kind of advantage or whatever they're trying to do. But if we have trusted relationships here, and people trust the fire chief and the police chief and the mayor or business leaders in town, and people say, no, 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 that's not what's happening. That's the best way to combat this stuff but that's hard. It's hard. It's almost hand-to-hand combat because there is a lot of distrust of government out there
And
right
Steve,
now.
my final question is this: what advice would you give young people or anyone who is looking to pursue a career in emergency management or public service in the context of what we were talking about, knowing yourself so that you can live a happy life?
We need you. I think the government and all these nonprofits, uh, and so many of the nonprofits now are doing aspects of what the government used to do 40 or 50 years ago. And it's sort of been offshored, so to speak,
It
to
has.
nonprofits. The homelessness epidemic in this country, all of that. I think, look, if you want to make a difference, a real big difference in your community or in your state or with the federal government. There are so many exciting jobs because of all the challenges that we face as a country and in a community to get involved. So figure it out. You could have a particular discipline. I'm interested in transportation, or I'm interested in the environment, or I'm interested in recreation and parks. I mean, there are opportunities in all of those areas within the government, and uh, and it's an amazing group of people. I have yet to work with folks that work for the government and think, oh, these people don't care or they're just here for the paycheck. That never
Yeah,
has crossed my mind. I mean, I
good
am
to hear that.
so impressed with people that have dedicated their careers to public service. And I hope, young people will look at the challenges that we have out there and think, well, how can I, make a difference with my life? And one way is certainly spending your time because you're going to spend more time working than anything else, spending your time working on some of these challenges that we have. It's the only way we're gonna move through them.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for joining me here on the next big thing. I just want to thank you for joining me. It's a delightful conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to the next big thing with Keith Terry. Our guest today is Mr. Steve Hagerty. And I just want to invite you to do a couple of things as my listeners. One, follow me. We are now being distributed on Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, and Spotify for the podcast version. I also have a YouTube channel. My YouTube channel is Keith D. Terry. Please like, subscribe, and follow me because we have a number of different episodes that I'd love for you to listen to. Other folks who are as passionate as Steve in different avenues across the United States, across globally. And I just want to thank you guys for listening. Steve, it was delightful. You have a phenomenal day. Thanks for listening to The Next Big Thing. I'm your host, Keith D. Terry. If you've enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support this podcast, please share it with others. Post about it on social media or leave a rating and a review. To catch all the latest from me, you can follow me on my YouTube channel at Keith D. Terry. If you want to recommend a guest, please email me at info@terryperformancegroup.com. This has been produced by your host and Jade Productions.